So, you know what an aha moment is? Probably, maybe some of you have had an aha moment. Every once in a while, I have one. I had one recently while I was working on this message, except this one was different. I was sitting in my kitchen having my coffee and reading and pondering and reflecting and even wrestling a little bit in my mind. And I was alone, and this is how it was different. On this morning when I had my aha moment, like I said, I was alone, but I think perhaps if someone had been there, they would have heard me literally say out loud, aha! Because I really think I said aha out loud. I don't normally do that. Usually it's just like in my head, it clicks. This morning it was like, aha! So now I have to tell you why, of course. But first, let me tell you a little about this second letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the people of Corinth. It must be fairly significant, after all, that the people of Corinth would receive not one, but two letters from Paul. So many other cities never received any. So why was Paul writing a second letter to the Corinthians? Well, there were a few reasons. The first was because Paul had some deep concerns about some of their behaviors after becoming Christians and members of the body of Christ. And so Paul had written them a letter to explain to them how their actions were in contradiction to living a life devoted to Christ. But because the Christians are only humans, one letter didn't quite garner the course correction that Paul was hoping for. Sound like anyone you know? It takes more than one time to hear something to get the message. And so Paul sent them a second letter. Sort of like, come on now, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times. Plus, he had come to learn that some of the folks there had misunderstood some of his words, and so he was writing to correct those misunderstandings. Another reason that he wrote the second letter to the people of Corinth was because he was being criticized there by some members of the community, and so he was writing to defend himself. We can see that in this passage that we heard just a moment ago. I heard someone say once that the Apostle Paul, in relation to how we receive him, when we know we're going to hear about him in church, is that sometimes we suffer from a sense of too much familiarity with Paul, meaning we hear about him so often that sometimes we just take for granted that we know what we need to know about him. We've heard him so many times, we've heard about him so many times, and so sometimes we're at risk of missing so much of the depth of his words. Sort of like, here we go again, more Paul. And when that happens, it's actually to our own detriment because Paul has so much to teach us. Not only the first time we're introduced to him, but constantly, because his message is living and moving like life itself. Which gets to my aha moment, but I'm not quite ready for that yet. So not only do we learn so many lessons about life from Paul's letters, but we learn so much about Paul himself. And it's through learning about him that we are most able to learn his lessons. And the second letter that he writes to the people of Corinth is possibly the most revealing of who Paul really is. We see the most human face of Paul in this particular letter. He tells us so many things about himself that we would be probably embarrassed to tell people about our own selves. He starts the letter off with the most sobering statement. He says, I even despaired of life itself. That is no small statement. Paul, who is supposed to be our hero in the faith, facing so much hardship that he would almost rather die than live. If Paul can't endure this thing called life, how are we supposed to? And as the letter goes on, Paul shares that he was distressed and had anguish in his heart, and he shed many tears. Paul loves the people of Corinth, but even more than that, he loves the gospel message and the freedom that he knows it can bring to people. And so he quite literally weeps for the emptiness that he knows the Corinthians will have until they really understand what Jesus means to the world as Paul understands it. Now, this has been said before, and I think that it tends to be somewhat true. I think we can sometimes forget the tenacious spirit that these early Christians had because we sometimes maybe get a little lost in the message of love and forgiveness that Christ brought to bear. I do think we really sometimes lose sight of the passion of the heroes of the Bible when we hear that Paul had anguish in his heart and shed many tears. We might think, well, that doesn't sound very strong or manly. But on the contrary, we need to lay Paul alongside other great and strong heroes of history who were so deeply moved by their dedication to justice and freedom that they too gave their whole lives for that cause. Think of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Martin Luther King Jr., all great men who we would easily count as heroes in the fight for freedom and justice. We need to remember to include Paul in that group. Little sidebar, if you haven't seen the movie Darkest Hour, rent it and watch it. Actually, it's playing uptown tonight and tomorrow night at the Orpheum. It's the story of Winston Churchill trying to decide if England should enter into a treaty with Germany, which in his heart of hearts, he felt would be making a compromise with Hitler and the Nazis. During the movie, there's this scene where he rides the subway with the common people because he's struggling and is not sure what he should do. He knows what the right thing to do is, but he really is wondering if the people see it the way that he does. And he finds out that they do. They know the threat of evil being brought to bear to the world through the Nazi regime. Churchill is overwhelmed by his internal sense of justice and freedom. And it's that exact same kind of spirit in which Paul is writing to the people of Corinth. Perhaps the enemy that they are battling isn't coming at them with tanks and guns. The enemy Paul knows they're battling is much, much more subtle, but no less of a threat to the cause of justice and freedom in their lives. In fact, on a certain level, Paul's battle is even more of a challenge because the enemy is not without, but it's within. And now you might think that I'm being overly dramatic, but think of it. If someone comes at you with a knife, you know where the threat is. But if a thought pierces your mind and leads you to think less of the freedom that you have through Christ, you might never realize you've been infiltrated by the enemy. So subtle was that thought. But it works its way into your heart over time and can severely undermine your understanding of what Christ means to the world. And the thing is, if our hearts and minds are infiltrated little by little in these subtle ways by the enemy, as I said, that might sound melodramatic to compare that to fighting a battle with the Nazis, but let me ask you this. If we had no sense for justice and freedom in our hearts and minds, why would we even care if the Nazis rolled over the whole European continent? The reason Churchill knew that Hitler needed to be stopped is because his internal sense for justice and freedom was fully engaged and had not been compromised by the enemy. So we should never think that this internal battle is irrelevant to everyday life or that it's minor, because it's not. It's where it all begins. Okay, I'm getting a little off track, but that was important, okay? That was important. Back to my aha moment. So this is where I was really struggling in regards to this particular passage from 2 Corinthians, the notion of suffering. Like, I've always kind of been drawn to the idea that suffering is inevitable as a Christian, and that even on some level, it's almost to be embraced as a good thing, sort of like it's evidence of the devotion one has to the faith, as in the more a person realizes what the Christian faith means for the world, And the more compelled a person is to do something about it, the more that person is bound to suffer. So that was kind of where I was heading. But I have to admit, the more I pondered it, and also read a number of essays on both sides of this particular issue, that I found myself sort of like, not quite sure. It was a weird feeling because it's an idea that I've sort of like given my heart over for probably as long as I can remember. In fact, a number of years ago in my old parish, I was teaching a confirmation class, and I asked the students what they felt was the primary goal God intended for their lives, and one student said something to the effect of, the thing God wants for us more than anything else is for us to be happy. I was like, what? No, that's not it. And if that's what you think after being in my confirmation class for 2 years, you haven't been listening. And this kid was like, well, then I have no idea. And as I was pondering this reading for today, though, I started thinking more about it, and I started wondering, was I wrong? All those years ago? And up until just this very moment? I mean, Jesus did say, I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly, but I never took that to mean that we were first and foremost meant to be happy. How self-serving would that be? But the more I pondered the notion of suffering, and even more so the notion of righteous suffering, I started to doubt it. I got to admit, I started to think about when in my own life am I most productive and most effective? And I realized that's when life is going good for me. That's when I'm productive. Yes, witnessing struggles and even experiencing them in my own life tend to give me a heightened sense of the injustices in the world, but sometimes I can find it difficult to rise up against them in those moments that I'm really feeling burdened by them. So where does that leave me? I was like, now what? In regards to my message for today, I thought that was going to leave me with sharing with you a bunch of questions, but no real answers. I thought they'll be okay with that. It's okay not to have all the answers. And I can't tell them something that I'm not sure of myself. That wouldn't be right. And in that moment, there came to me a quote from the musical Fiddler on the Roof, which seemed to summarize the reason for my quandary. And so I went to my computer to search online for the exact quote, which you may know. It's when Tevye the father says, I realize, of course, it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. And you know how when you search something online on your computer, it shows a whole bunch of options of what your computer thinks you're looking for. So I typed in that little line from Fiddler on the Roof, so it lead me to the exact quote. And I went to click on it, and just as I did, my eye caught a different suggestion for a different quote on a different website that was like in my peripheral vision. I'm looking here, and just as I clicked, I just happened to see this other line down below. And I stopped, and I did a double take, and I clicked on that other option instead. And it was a passage from the book of Proverbs, chapter 30, which I have to say is not a particular book of the Bible I frequent very often. This is what it said. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that I need, or I shall be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or I shall be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. And that's when I went, aha! Because I realized it isn't whether or not we suffer. It isn't whether suffering is to be embraced or to be guarded against. It isn't about suffering at all. It is about knowing that through it all, we are the Lord's, and that nothing matters more than that. Amen.